The following story contains intense depictions of military combat and its aftermath, including scenes that may trigger symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. This content may be distressing for some listeners, especially military veterans. Viewer discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling with PTSD, please seek support. You are not alone. Sergeant Nathan Cole sat rigid in the cramped office, the fluorescent lights humming above him like a distant drone, an all-too-familiar sound. The military psychiatrist across from him was talking, something about post-deployment adjustment and emotional health, but Cole wasn't listening. His answers were rote, automatic, the kind of responses that would pass as normal. But behind his steel-gray eyes, something churned like a storm. "How have you been sleeping?" the doctor asked. Cole's jaw twitched. Sleeping? His mind flickered with images, scattered like broken glass, of the battlefield. Gunfire, the dull thud of mortars, and the desperate, rasping breaths of the dying. And then, there was the boy. Always the boy. Blood, like dark crimson syrup, had soaked through the kid's torn clothes. Cole had tried to stop the bleeding, hands slick with the warmth of death. But the boy's eyes had been wide with terror, the kind that burrows into a man's soul. Then, that last breath. A wet, rattling exhale. And silence. "Sergeant Cole?" The doctor's voice pulled him back. "Fine," Cole lied, forcing the words past a throat that felt like it was closing. "I've been fine." The outpost sat at the edge of a vast forest, remote, desolate, and bleak as a tomb. The sun set early here, its dying light barely filtering through the gnarled skeletal trees before being swallowed by night. Only 5 soldiers manned the outpost, and the thin numbers left the place feeling like an abandoned graveyard. Cole unpacked his duffel bag in the barracks, the air cold and stale. His mind buzzed with exhaustion, though sleep was something that had eluded him since his return. It wasn't long before Cole noticed something was off. The radio, perched on a shelf in the corner, had been emitting strange bursts of static since he'd arrived. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Old equipment, signal interference. But late that night, as he lay in the dark, the static took on a different tone. It sounded like a voice, whispering. Faint, but insistent, as though it was crawling through the airwaves, trying to get inside his skull. He sat up, listening. His pulse quickened, his fingers twitching as they hovered over the side of the bed. "Cole." The whisper was unmistakable now. His breath caught in his throat. He stared at the radio. The static faded, leaving only an eerie silence. Just my mind playing tricks. But as he tried to settle back down, the door to the barracks creaked open. He glanced at it. No one there. Just the yawning void of the dark hallway. Cole climbed out of bed and shut the door, his skin prickling with unease. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. The dreams returned that night. Vivid, brutal dreams. He was back on the battlefield, the weight of his rifle in his hands, the acrid scent of burning metal in his nostrils. His squad moved ahead, their boots sinking into the mud, and then the barrage hit. Explosions tore through the air, ripping flesh from bone, shrapnel spinning like blades. Cole's comrades screamed, their bodies flung like rag dolls, twisted and broken. He tried to run toward them, but his legs wouldn't move. He was rooted to the ground, paralyzed. And then they turned to him, his dead comrades. Their faces, grotesque and bloated, peeled back from their skulls. Eyeballs hung loosely in their sockets, tongues lolling from gaping mouths. "You let us die," they screamed in unison, their words garbled through torn vocal cords, blood bubbling from their lips. Cole woke with a jolt. His body slick with cold sweat, his heart thudding like a war drum. The barracks were silent, but he could still hear them, those voices. Faint, but there, in the walls. They clawed at his mind, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the hallucinations away. It's not real. It's just the PTSD. But when he opened his eyes again, something was wrong. There, at the edge of his bed, stood a figure. The outline was familiar. Too familiar. It was Private Parker. His uniform was torn, blood soaked through the fabric, dripping in thick rivulets onto the floor. His face was a mask of death, half of it blown away from a mortar shell that Cole knew had killed him months ago. Cole stared in horror, unable to breathe. "Why didn't you save us, Sergeant?" Parker's voice rasped from a mouth that barely moved. His dead eyes locked onto Cole's. "Why did you let us die?" The figure lurched forward, and Cole scrambled back, his hands finding nothing but cold concrete as he slammed into the wall. Parker's mangled body twitched and jerked toward him, his skin peeling in wet strips, chunks of meat dropping onto the floor like rotten fruit. Cole squeezed his eyes shut. When he opened them, Parker was gone. The only sound was the thudding of his pulse in his ears and the distant crackle of the radio. The days blurred together. The whispers grew louder, the lights more erratic. Cole barely ate, barely slept. The other soldiers noticed but said nothing. They were too busy dealing with their own demons. The outpost felt cursed, infected with some kind of unseen rot that gnawed at their souls. One night, Cole couldn't take it anymore. The air was thick with a tension that made his skin itch. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when he heard it again. His name. Clearer this time, unmistakable. "Cole!" He bolted upright, heart racing. The voice wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was outside. He grabbed his boots, laced them tight, and stepped out into the cold night air. The outpost was dead quiet, the wind barely rustling the trees. But there, just beyond the tree line, stood a figure. Cole squinted. He knew that figure. He'd seen it before, in the nightmare-drenched haze of battle. Private Parker. The dead soldier stood motionless, his tattered uniform flapping in the breeze. His face was still twisted in the grotesque grin of death. Without thinking, Cole stepped forward, boots crunching in the frost-covered grass. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. "Parker?" Cole's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the stillness. He took another step, and then another, until he was almost within arm's reach. But when he reached out, Parker vanished, like smoke dissolving into the night. Cole stood there, alone in the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at the spot where Parker had stood, feeling a chill deeper than the cold creeping into his bones. The whispers from the radio echoed in the back of his mind, and for the first time, Cole wondered if he would ever make it out of this place alive. The days at the outpost crawled by, each one indistinguishable from the last. Cole barely slept. The walls felt like they were closing in on him, suffocating, as if the outpost itself was alive and watching. His fellow soldiers noticed the changes in him, how his eyes had grown darker, his face more gaunt. But no one said anything. They all had their own ghosts, and Cole was no different. Yet the whispers never left him. It was late afternoon, and the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the outpost in an eerie orange glow. Cole sat alone in the mess hall, staring at his uneaten meal. The air was thick with tension, as though something unspeakable lingered just out of sight. The other soldiers, Davis and Greer, huddled at a table across from him, their voices low and nervous. As Cole watched them, his mind wandered, slipping between reality and memory. Flashes of the battlefield surfaced. Corpses rotting in the dirt, the stench of death. Parker's lifeless body slumped in the mud, his eyes wide and accusing. The taste of blood lingered on his tongue, the smell of burning flesh in his nose. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push it all away. "You let us die." Cole's eyes snapped open. The voice was faint, but clear. He looked around the empty room, heart racing. Davis and Greer were still talking, but they hadn't heard it. Cole. There it was again. This time, closer. He shot up from his seat, the chair screeching across the floor. Davis glanced up, frowning. "You all right, man?" Cole's pulse thundered in his ears. "You didn't hear that?" "Hear what?" Davis asked, his brow furrowed. "That voice," Cole whispered, his throat dry. It said my name." Davis exchanged a worried look with Greer. "There's no one here but us, Sergeant." Cole didn't respond. He turned and marched out of the mess hall, his hands shaking. He needed air. He needed to get out of this place. The outpost's perimeter was silent, unnaturally so. The wind barely stirred the dead trees that surrounded the base. Cole walked along the edge, rifle slung over his shoulder, scanning the tree line. There was nothing. No sign of movement, no sound except for his own heavy breathing. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching him. Suddenly, the radio clipped to his belt crackled to life, filling the air with static. Cole froze, heart hammering. The static grew louder, more insistent, and then, beneath the noise, he heard it. Cole. His blood ran cold. He fumbled with the radio, turning the volume down, but the voice persisted, creeping into his skull. "You let us die." He yanked the radio free and hurled it into the woods. It hit the ground with a dull thud, and the voice cut out. But the silence that followed was worse. He stood there, breathing heavily, the wind biting at his exposed skin. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow, just at the edge of the trees. It was subtle, barely there, but enough to send a spike of terror through him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The shadow didn't move. Cole's fingers tightened around the grip of his rifle. Slowly, he advanced toward the trees, his boots crunching on the frosty ground. As he drew closer, the shadow began to take shape. It was a figure. A man, hunched and twisted, standing between the trees. Parker. The dead soldier's face was half hidden in shadow, but Cole knew it was him. His tattered uniform hung off his skeletal frame, blood still seeping from the wounds that had killed him. Cole's breath came in ragged gasps. "You're not real," he whispered. "You can't be real." Parker didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared, his dead eyes locked on Cole's, a silent accusation. "You let us die." Cole stumbled back, his mind spiraling into chaos. The world tilted, and suddenly he was back on the battlefield. Parker's body crumpled in the mud, his blood mixing with the dirt. The sounds of gunfire, explosions, and screams filled his ears, and the coppery taste of blood flooded his mouth. "You let us die." The voice echoed in his skull, louder, more insistent. Cole clutched his head, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The dead were everywhere, in the trees, in the shadows, crawling through the mud, reaching for him with decayed hands. Their faces were twisted in agony, their skin peeling away like paper, their eyes hollow and accusing. "You let us die!" Suddenly, Cole felt a hand on his shoulder. He whirled around, his rifle raised, finger on the trigger. It was Davis. "Whoa, easy." Davis held up his hands, his face pale. "What the hell, man?" Cole blinked, the battlefield vanishing in an instant. He was back at the outpost, the cold wind biting at his skin, the shadows of the trees looming over him. "You were screaming," Davis said, his voice shaky. "What the hell is going on with you?" Cole lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. I saw him." Davis frowned. "Saw who?" "Parker," Cole whispered. "He was right there, standing in the trees." Davis looked toward the tree line, his expression skeptical. "There's no one there, Cole. You've been out here too long." Cole's heart pounded in his chest. "I saw him, Davis. He was dead, but I saw him." Davis sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You need to get some rest. You're not thinking straight." But Cole knew what he had seen. He wasn't losing his mind. Parker was there, just as real as the day he died. And he wasn't alone. That night, the dreams returned, worse than ever. Cole was back in the trenches, the stench of death thick in the air. His squad moved ahead, their boots sinking into the mud, and then the ambush hit. Mortars rained down, tearing through flesh, spraying blood and bone in every direction. Screams filled the air, soldiers clutching their torn limbs, their eyes wide with terror. Cole tried to move, but his legs wouldn't obey. He was frozen in place, watching as his comrades fell one by one, their bodies torn apart by shrapnel. And then he saw him, Parker, crawling through the mud, his face twisted in agony, his intestines spilling out behind him. "Help me," Parker rasped, blood pouring from his mouth. Cole reached for him, but the ground swallowed him whole. He screamed, his body sinking into the earth, the mud filling his lungs. And then everything went black. Cole woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He was drenched in sweat, his sheets tangled around him like a noose. The barracks were silent, but the air was thick with the scent of decay. He sat up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and then he heard it, the sound of footsteps. slow, deliberate, coming from the hall. Cole's pulse quickened. He grabbed his rifle, heart racing, and crept toward the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He threw the door open, his finger hovering over the trigger. Standing in the hall was Private Alvarez. But something was wrong. Alvarez's face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stood motionless in front of the mirror, his mouth slightly open, as if frozen in place. His reflection stared back at Cole, but there was something off about it. Something that made Cole's skin crawl. Alvarez began to speak, his voice low and monotone. "They're waiting for you." Cole's stomach dropped. "They're waiting for you," Alvarez repeated, his eyes locked on Cole's. Suddenly, Alvarez's body crumpled to the floor, lifeless. His head hit the ground with a sickening crack, his mouth still frozen in that eerie, vacant expression. Cole backed away, his hands shaking. He stared at the body, his mind racing. The radio, the voices, Parker. None of it made sense. But one thing was clear: the dead were not done with him. Cole's world had become a fog of terror and confusion, his mind unraveling piece by piece. He could no longer separate his nightmares from reality, his guilt from the truth. The outpost had turned into a living nightmare, and now Alvarez was dead. His final words, a chilling omen. "They're waiting for you." The lifeless body still lay on the cold barracks floor, eyes wide open, staring blankly at nothing. The room smelled of death, a pungent, metallic odor that clung to Cole's skin. His hands shook violently as he gripped his rifle. The cold steel, the only thing tethering him to reality. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, sounding like distant screams carried on the cold air. The outpost was quiet. Too quiet. Cole could feel the eyes of the dead watching him from every shadow, lurking in every corner, waiting. Davis and Greer were the only soldiers left, and even they were starting to look at Cole like he was the enemy. They stayed away from him, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes filled with suspicion. The fear in the air was thick, and it was clear that none of them trusted each other anymore. Cole sat at the edge of his cot, staring at the ground, his mind buzzing with Alvarez's words. "They're waiting for you." Waiting for what? What did Alvarez mean? His thoughts spiraled as he replayed every death in his head. Parker, Alvarez, the rest of his squad back on the battlefield. Their faces haunted him. Their screams gnawed at the edges of his sanity. "This is your fault," a voice whispered in his head. "You let them die." Cole pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to drown out the voices, but they only grew louder. The dead were everywhere, their rotting faces flashing before him, their cold hands reaching out. That night, the whispers began again. It was faint at first, just a soft hiss in the back of his mind. But then it grew, like 100 voices all speaking at once, their words indecipherable, like an army of the dead gathering just beyond the veil of reality. The air around him felt heavy, thick with unseen things, their presence choking him. Cole stood, rifle in hand, his body tense. He couldn't stay in the barracks any longer. The walls were closing in, the shadows stretching out like claws ready to drag him into the abyss. Without a word to Davis or Greer, he stepped outside into the cold night air. The outpost was bathed in an eerie silver glow from the moon, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The ground was slick with frost, and the wind carried the faint sound of whispers through the darkness. Cole. The voice was unmistakable this time. He spun around, heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, was the figure of a man. Parker. His dead, hollow eyes gleamed in the moonlight, his body barely more than a shadow in the mist. Blood still dripped from his uniform, soaking the ground beneath him. Cole's grip tightened on his rifle. "You're not real," he muttered, his breath clouding in the cold air. "You're dead." Parker stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "We're all dead, Cole." Cole stumbled back, his pulse racing. He could feel the earth shifting beneath him, as if reality itself was crumbling. His comrades' voices rang out in his head, louder now, screaming his name, cursing him, blaming him. "You let us die," Parker rasped, his face twisting into a grotesque grin. His skin peeled away, chunks of rotted flesh falling to the ground like wet leaves. Behind him, more figures emerged from the darkness. His entire squad, their bodies mutilated, their faces contorted in pain. Cole raised his rifle, his hands trembling. "Stay back." But the dead soldiers didn't stop. They moved closer, their decayed fingers reaching for him, their eyes burning with accusation. "You let us die," they moaned, their voices a chorus of suffering. Cole's breath came in short gasps. "No, I didn't. I tried. You failed." Parker's voice rose, his face now inches from Cole's. "You let us rot." The dead closed in, their hands clawing at him, cold and wet, pulling him down into the earth. The mud beneath him was thick, like quicksand, swallowing him whole. He screamed, thrashing against them, but their grip was too strong. His rifle slipped from his grasp, disappearing into the muck. "You let us die," they chanted, their voices filling his head until it felt like his skull would split open. Cole's vision blurred as he sank deeper into the mud. The dead soldiers towered over him, their faces distorted by rot and decay, their voices an endless torment. He felt the cold weight of their hands pressing down on his chest, crushing the breath from his lungs. Then, suddenly, the pressure lifted. The cold hands vanished. Cole gasped for air, his body trembling. He blinked, disoriented, and realized he was no longer in the clearing. He was back on the battlefield. The sky was a sickly, blood-red hue, and the ground was littered with bodies. His squad, torn apart by shrapnel and gunfire. The stench of death was overpowering, the air thick with smoke and blood. Cole stumbled to his feet, his mind spinning. Gunfire echoed in the distance, and Cole instinctively reached for his rifle, but it was gone. The screams of dying men filled the air, their voices raw and desperate. He turned, and there they were, his squad, lying in the dirt, their bodies broken and twisted. Parker's lifeless eyes stared up at him, his mouth open in a silent scream. This isn't real. This can't be real. But it felt real. The blood was real. The death was real. Cole could taste the bitterness of gunpowder on his tongue, feel the mud sucking at his boots. "Sergeant!" a voice called from behind him. Cole spun around and saw Corporal Davis running toward him, his face pale with fear. "We have to move. They're coming." Cole's heart pounded in his chest. "Who's coming?" "The dead!" Davis shouted, his eyes wild. "They're everywhere." Cole's blood ran cold. He looked past Davis, and in the distance he saw them. Hundreds of dead soldiers crawling from the earth, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes filled with hatred. "You let us die!" they screamed in unison, their voices rising to a deafening roar. Cole grabbed Davis by the arm. "We need to get out of here." But as they ran, the ground beneath them began to shake. The earth split open, and from the cracks emerged more of the dead, their rotting hands reaching for Cole, their faces twisted in rage. "You can't run." Parker's voice echoed in Cole's mind. "You can never escape." Cole stumbled, his heart racing, his lungs burning. The dead were closing in, their cold hands grasping at him, pulling him down. Suddenly Davis screamed. Cole turned just in time to see him disappear beneath a swarm of decayed hands, his body swallowed by the earth. Cole's pulse thundered in his ears as he ran, his vision blurring. But no matter how fast he ran, the dead were always there, right behind him, their voices like knives in his brain. "You let us die." The battlefield stretched out endlessly before him, a never-ending wasteland of death and despair. The sky turned black, and the ground opened up beneath him, revealing a bottomless abyss. Cole skidded to a halt at the edge of the chasm, his breath ragged. The dead were right behind him, their eyes glowing in the darkness. This is it, he thought. There's no escape. As the dead closed in, Cole felt the ground give way beneath his feet. He plunged into the abyss, the screams of the dead echoing all around him, their cold hands pulling him down into the darkness. When Cole opened his eyes, he was lying in the mud, the cold rain pouring down on his face. The battlefield was gone, replaced by the desolate clearing of the outpost. The radio crackled nearby, a soft, eerie static filling the air. Cole sat up, his body trembling. The outpost was silent. Davis and Greer were nowhere to be seen. The barracks stood empty, the doors swinging gently in the wind. He was alone. The radio crackled again, and this time, a voice emerged from the static. The war never ended, Sergeant. Cole's heart sank. He stared at the radio, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. You'll never leave. Cole dropped to his knees, his hands digging into the cold earth. He could feel the weight of the dead pressing down on him, their voices still whispering in the wind. The war would never end. It would never end.